farm subsidies and how the problem was handled by the first Secretary of Agriculture. My story today is, I think, rather unusual. First of all, I want to use the Bible as my text. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do these days because whenever you mention the Bible, you usually run into two types of people. Either those who are angry if you don't use it, or those who are angry if you do. Now, I want to use it, and I don't want anybody to be angry, so I want you to understand that I'm making use of the Bible not because I'm an advocate or an opponent. I'm making use of it because it has a very good story in it that tells a very interesting lesson, and it's something that we might profit by. Whether you like the Bible or believe in it or not, the story is a crackerjack, and it ought to be known. So this goes back to the time, and you'll find this story incidentally in Genesis, and all I'm going to do is tell the story in, let me say, more or less praxeological terms. Okay? Anyway, this goes back to the time when Joseph was born and grew up to be a young lad of 17. Now, you may recall Joseph. He had two parents. Now, that's not altogether unique, but the interesting thing about Joseph was that he was the child of the old age of his parents, and thus he turned out to be the youngest child. Usually the last one born is the youngest. And this was true of Joseph, and he grew up with having a number of brothers who were older than he was. You see, that follows when you're youngest. Now, Joseph, we begin to discover a little bit about his character at an early age. He seemed to have a considerable amount of self-esteem. The first record we have of him indicates this little experience. Apparently he had a dream, and he confronted his brothers, and he said, "Fellows, I've had a dream last night, and I want to tell you what it was. In my dream, all of you were shocks of wheat, and I was a shock of wheat too, and in my dream, all of your shocks bowed down to my shock." And they said, "That's rather shocking." And they were disturbed about it. But Joseph was not too upset about it. He went about his business and confronted them on the following day, and he says, "Fellas, you remember I was telling you about my dream the other night? Well, I've had another one, and this one was in Technicolor. This was a great dream." He says, "In this dream, all of us were stars in the sky, and Dad and Mom were there too. Dad was the sun and Mom was the moon, and my star was so bright that it outshone all the other stars and the sun and the moon. And in my dream, the sun and the moon and all the stars bowed down to my star." And they said, "Oh, brother." And they got a gunny sack and put it over his head and said, "Where do we hide the body?" And while they were debating this unpleasant task that they thought confronted them, they got to arguing among themselves and decided they really ought not to kill him because Dad would never forgive them. And just at the nick of time in true Hollywood style, what should happen? But over the nearest hill came a caravan heading into the big city, and their commercial instincts took hold, and they said, "We can't sell him if he's dead." So they tied Joseph up and put a gag in his mouth so he couldn't complain, and they hailed the chief of the caravan, and they said, "We've got a runaway slave here. How much can we get for him?" Well, the price is recorded. They got 20 pieces of silver, which, is a pretty good price for a runaway slave. Anyway, Joseph was tossed up into the pannier of a camel, and the fellows went back to tell Dad a cock and bull story that they'd invented in the meantime of how they disposed of the body. Anyway, as we say in Hollywood, the camera follows Joseph. He must have had a whale of a ride. Anyway, it was going down into Egypt, and it arrived at an oasis. This was where there was a fellow that had a ranch. An oasis is just a ranch with a well. That's what this was. There was a ranch with a well that we call an oasis if you live over there. And this camel caravan came up and stopped to water the camels. And the man who owned the ranch came out to get the latest news. You see, this is before the days of the Los Angeles Times and the Santa Ana Register and things like that. And the only way you could get any information was by word of mouth. So this caravan had pulled up, and the man who owned the ranch came out. His name is Potiphar. And so he started talking to the captain of the caravan, getting the latest information, and he noticed that one of the panniers on the camel kept sort of jumping every now and again, and so he finally said, what have you got in there, you know? Well, the fellow running the caravan was a little nervous about Joseph anyway, because he didn't really have a verified bill of sale, you know. So he said, well, I've got a runaway slave, and if you're interested, I could sell him cheap. And Potiphar said, well, it just happens I could use another house servant, so if the price isn't too high, why, we've got a deal. This price is not recorded. I don't know what the sale, I can only say I hope the caravan made a little profit here. But anyway, Joseph was sold to Potiphar, and then the caravan went on about its business. And of course, poor Joseph just stood there. His hands were tied and the gag in his mouth. And after the dust from the caravan settled, why, Potiphar turned around and took out the gag and untied him, whereupon Joseph executed a little bow and said, Mr. Potiphar, sir, this is your lucky day. And Potiphar said, it is what makes it so lucky. He says, well, you've just met me. And he says, of course, I know. I look like an ordinary guy, but actually, I'm a genius. As a matter of fact, he said, I really have a pipeline. It isn't me, but I have friends upstairs. And if you are nice to me, everything is going to work out. Well, Potiphar said, oh, is that so? So he said, let's put you to work and see what you can do. Well, it happened. Joseph had been raised on a ranch, and he understood farm work. And from the time Joseph got on that ranch, it prospered. The crops came in well. The increase in the flocks occurred. Everything was really flourishing. And Joseph was an ambitious young fellow and worked his way into the confidence of Potiphar. And before long, he was the head wrangler, managing the affairs of the ranch. Well, then one day there was a little problem that came up, and Potiphar had to go into town. Now Potiphar, you have to understand, is a man of parts. He not only had this ranch, which he operated, but in addition, he was a captain of the Pharaoh's guard. And then on top of that, he also ran the jail. I mean, this fellow, you know, had had his hand in both sides of the fence. So he had to go in on the Pharaoh's business, and he left Joseph in charge of the ranch. And what happened, we're not quite certain. You see, we get conflicting reports here, but apparently Joseph had to go into the house to look at last year's grape records. And as he was walking down the corridor, why, Mrs. Potiphar accosted him. Now, well, that's one of the stories, at least. We're not sure who accosted whom, as a matter of fact, but the upshot of it was that through some kind of a confrontation that occurred between her and Joseph, he left his cloak in her possession and skedaddled out of the building. So when Potiphar got home that night, you know, and started to walk over to the house to go in to get supper, why, Mrs. Potiphar came running out of the house crying, and she said, oh, husband mine, what a terrible thing you've done to leave this whole property in the charge of this miscreant, Joseph. Why, he accosted me and he made absolutely improper suggestions to me, but fortunately I screamed and scared him away, but I grabbed his cloak, and see, I have it here. Well, of course, Joseph was standing there, you know, twisting his hat, and first on one foot and then another, and finally says, honest boss, you know, that's not quite the way it was. He said, now, I was innocently going in the house. I had to get these records, and she grabbed me. I'm ticklish. And, you know, I had to get away, and I did. But I didn't say anything out of place or anything like that. Well, Potiphar listened and weighed the evidence, what there was. Most of the evidence was just a cloak. And he finally decided, rightly or wrongly, we don't know, and he took Joseph by the scruff of the neck and took him over to the dungeon, which he was in charge of too, and threw him in. Whereupon Joseph, who was never at a loss under situations of this type, turned around and he said, well, okay, boss, you got to live with her, not me. I understand. It's all right. But he said, you know, if I've got to be here in this crummy jail, how about making me a trustee? You know I'm a good organizer. I'll get this thing, you know, running at a profit if you'll give me a chance. So Potiphar said, okay, you can be the head man on the inside. I'll be the head man outside. Just as long as you stay in, why, you can run it. And so Joseph did this. He took over, and, you know, he had that jail whipped around in good shape in very short time. Now, there's another part of this story that comes in. The Pharaoh at this time, he gets into the act. He's a very interesting man, this Pharaoh. He's something of a gourmand, you know, loved rich food. And he had a delicate stomach. He couldn't really handle it too well. So one night he apparently had an attack of indigestion, and he figured he'd been poisoned. Well, now, he knew he had it coming, but anyway, he went over in his mind who could have done this to him, and there were only two people that had access to the food before it was served. One was the butler that actually served it, and the other was the baker that had cooked it. See, it had been lobster thermidor, highly spiced, and it had really given him an attack. Well, he was taking no chances, so he had both the baker and the butler arrested and thrown into jail, and they came under the purview of our friend Joseph, who is now the head man in the jail. So he got acquainted with these two fellows and used to, run errands for them, get them cigarettes or whatever they needed. And one day when Joseph was making the rounds one morning, he heard these two fellows crying, just sobbing and carrying on in their cell. They had the same cell, economy move. And he went to the cell and said, "What in the Sam Hill's the matter with you guys? What you crying about?" And they said, "Well, Joseph, we've had a dream." Well, now that could get you. I mean, here's two guys and they had one dream. But this is before Freud, and you could do that. Anyway, they'd had this dream, and Joseph said, "Well," he said, "if what you need is an interpreter. But human beings can't interpret dreams. But fortunately, I do have connections, and if you want to tell me what the dream is, I'll see if I can get a message down." So they told him their dream. There were slight variations, but fundamentally it's the same story. And Joseph listened to it, and he said, "Yeah, I'm getting a signal. Hotline's open. Here it is." He said, what your dream signifies is that within 3 days, the Pharaoh is going to have a birthday party, and at that time, you both are going to be taken out of the jail, and you're going to be adjudged, and one of you is going to be returned to favor, and the other is going to be hanged. They both thanked him, which sort of creates the impression in my mind that maybe they both thought they were innocent. The chances are pretty good that they were. Anyway, it happened as Joseph had foreseen. Of course, in those days, if you understand the legal system they had in Egypt at that time, it really does explain what happened, because the only time they ever had any trials was on the occasion of the Pharaoh's birthday. When you were thrown into jail then, you just stayed in jail until his birthday came up, and then you came out, and your sins were examined, whatever they were. If the Pharaoh approved of you and felt that you'd been wrongly accused or something, then you were rewarded, and he might give you money or property or anything. But if he thought you were wrong, well, then you were put to death, and there were a number of ingenious ways of doing it, colorful, to amuse the crowd. So anyway, this was a big gala for the birthday, and the two fellows were taken out, and the butler was restored to favor, and the baker was hanged. Well, the butler came back to the jail to pick up his shaving kit and other things, and he ran into Joseph, and Joseph said, "It worked out, huh?" And he said, "Yes, boy, you're great. You're the best dream interpreter I ever ran into." And Joseph said, "Well, keep it in mind." He says, I know I'm head man in the jail, but, I've got bigger ambitions than this, so put in a good word for me when you get up in the palace. And the butler promised to do this, but he completely forgot it, and he was restored to favor, and 2 years went by with Joseph still there in the jail. And then this Pharaoh had another problem. Again, he'd overeaten, and this time he had a real dream. And as a matter of fact, he woke up screaming. And the dream that he'd had, it's one of the most famous dreams in all literature. I'm sure you remember it. It's the one where the 7 cows come up out of the river, and they move into the field and they start devouring the corn. And then 7 lean cows come out and they devour the fat cows. And it's a big thing. And that's what scared the Pharaoh, because cows are vegetarian. So anyway, he woke up in the middle of the night screaming, and he called for his soothsayers and necromancers and economists, anybody. It was not particular. And he asked him to come in and interpret his dream. Well, they came in and they started in trying to interpret it, and the more they told him about it, why, the less he understood, and he was getting a good head of steam on and getting ready to have some heads roll. And the butler suddenly remembered. And he said, "Wait a minute, oh great Pharaoh," whatever you say to pharaohs, the best interpreter in the dream business is down in your jail. And he described what had happened to him, you see, under a prior situation. So the Pharaoh says, "What are we waiting for? Get him up here. I want him to interpret this dream." Well, they sent for Joseph. Now, just to give you a little insight on Joseph, you think he came right then? Not Joseph. He's a smart boy. He got shaved, perfumed, took a shower, put on clean clothes. I mean, this is his court appearance, and he's going to make an impression. So he got himself ready. And when he was ready, and of course the Pharaoh was stewing, and got pains all the time. So finally, Joseph put in an appearance and bowed very graciously and said, "O Lord of the north and south, ruler of the two lands, what may thy most humble servant do?" And the Pharaoh said, "I've had a lousy night," and proceeded to tell him the dream. And Joseph said, "Well, as a matter of fact," he said, "only the divine can interpret dreams. Fortunately, I'm here. If you'll just tell me what the dream is, I'll see if I can get an interpretation." And the Pharaoh told him the dream, and Joseph said, "Well, actually, it's fundamentally simple. You see, the 7 rich cows, the 7 fat cows, that indicates 7 years of plenty that are coming to the land of Egypt. But after that, you're going to have a famine. You got 7 bad years coming. And so what you need to do is to have a Secretary of Agriculture who will manage the economy. See, what you've got, what you want to do is produce the ever-normal granary so that you don't have a boom or a bust. So get yourself a Secretary of Agriculture, and the whole thing can be handled," at which point Joseph bowed and started to retire. And the Pharaoh said, "Now, wait a minute. What is a Secretary of Agriculture? I never heard of anybody like that. What's he do?" "Well," Joseph said, "you give him economic control of all the food. That's what he does." And you see, what you have to do, you have to get a picture. You see, in the lean years, you get kind of a trough. It's a depression. There isn't enough to go around. But remember, you got some good years ahead of it. Now, that's a convex. See, this is concave, the other's convex. Now, so when you have the surpluses, you take them away and you store them for the bad times that are coming, and then you have the ever-normal granary. See, it just goes across even. You don't have too much to begin with. You don't have too little later. And he said, "So get yourself a Secretary of Agriculture," and he started to bow out again. The Pharaoh said, "Now, wait just a minute. You don't leave till I tell you to. I never heard of this job before, but that's a pretty good idea. What are you doing right now?" Joseph said, "Well, as a matter of fact, I'm not too busy." And the Pharaoh said, "Okay, how would you like to be my Secretary of Agriculture?" Joseph said, "What's in it for me?" "Well, what's in it?" He says, "I'll tell you what's in it. You get to be the number 2 man in the kingdom. After me, you come first." And he says, "I'll give you, I'll even build a new building for you. You get a whole bureau with all the bureaucrats and secretaries, and I'll get you a new chariot and, people to run in front and throw out flowers and say, 'Gangway, gangway for the Lord High Secretary of Agriculture.'" Joseph said, "I'll take it." The Pharaoh actually handed him a ring and said, "Wear this, and any time you flash that ring, the rest of you people, keep that in mind when you see that ring, jump, because that's my will that Joseph be the head man after me." So Joseph took over. And what did he do? Well, the very thing you'd expect him to do. He imposed a tax on the people of Egypt, a tax to be paid in produce, not in money, because the people didn't have the money. So he taxed them 1/5 of all they produced. But times were good, and the people could pay it. So they got their drays and their camels and their carts, and they dragged it in to the central city. And Joseph had his bookkeepers come out, and they checked it off and gave everybody a tax receipt, And then they started storing it. And this went on for 7 years. The crops were plentiful. The times were good. The people didn't complain because they had enough, and they could pay their taxes too. So all went well for 7 years. And then the dark days came. Whether the dark days were precipitated in part by the tax, I don't know. But it came. It is said, in fact, an inscription appears in one of the pyramids on this point, that there was a year when the Nile failed to overflow. And in Egypt, that Nile is the thing on which farm life, in fact, virtually all life depends. And without the Nile overflow, there was no crop, and famine descended upon the land, even as Joseph had predicted. So the land turned dry, and great cracks ran through it, and the birds fell down and died, and nothing grew. And at the end of the growing season, there was no harvest, and the farmers were now poor, and the people had nothing. So they got together, and they came into the central city in a great body, and they appeared before the palace, and they marched around the palace chanting and singing, "We shall overcome." And then they got in front again, and they prostrated themselves, and they said, "O great Pharaoh, thy people starve." And the Pharaoh came out on the balcony. They always have balconies. And he said, "We planned it this, if you'll just go across the street to the Secretary of Agriculture, he's in charge of famines. So if you just go over there and make your appeal to him, everything will be all right." So they got up and dusted themselves off, and they paraded around the Secretary of Agricultural building, and then they prostrated themselves there, and they said, "O great Secretary of Agriculture, thy people starve." And Joseph came out on the top step. He didn't have a balcony. And he said, "Have you got any complaints?" And they said, "No, we're just hungry." Well, he said, "That's odd." He said, "I thought you produced the food." They said, "We did, but we didn't get any this year." He says, "Well, I've got grain." They said, "Yeah, we remember." He says, "Well, I could let you have some grain." And they said, "Well, that's wonderful." He said, "Naturally, you people wouldn't want it handed to you." He says, "I'll sell it to you." Well, they said, "That's all right. We've got our pride. We'll buy it." He said, "Fine, I'll sell it to you." And he did. He sold them grain for their money. Now, the price isn't mentioned in the good book, but if you take a look, you discover that he took all the money they had, because the next phrase says, "and the money failed." He got it all. But he gave them grain in exchange for their money, and they were happy because they got fed, and so they took their grain back out, and everything was fine. But you see, the next year, there was no produce either. And so this time, the people were really in dire straits, and they came back again. And this time, they didn't even fuss with the palace. They knew where the grain was. So they did their demonstration, and they went over there and said, "O great Joseph, thy people starve. We're back." And he said, "I see that you are, and I still have grain." And they said, "Yeah, we know. We saw the supplies. Looks like a good supply." He said, "Well, fine, I'll sell you some more." And they said, "Sell? Who's kidding who? You took all our money last time. We haven't got any money." Oh, he says, "I'm not a hard man. You must have something." They said, "Well, all we've got is the tools of production, the oxen and the carts and the tools, things like that." He says, "All right, I'll take that." So he did. He took their tools in exchange for grain. But they were happy. What the heck, they could eat. So they took their grain and they went back, and another year went by. And then they came back the next year, realizing that they were now powerless to produce because they didn't have the tools. And so they were really in even a worse condition than before. And this time when they appealed, and they went through this same little pantomime, why, Joseph said, "Okay, I'll sell you some grain. What'll you give me for it?" And they said, "Now, look, you've gone far enough. You have everything that isn't nailed down." He said, "Well, you've still got the land." And they said, "Yes, we do." He says, "I'll take that." So they deeded their property over to Joseph in exchange for food. And the next year when they came back, they had nothing. In fact, he had let them go back to live on his land. And now when they came, they were completely destitute. And he said, "Now, my friends, we solve the problem. Because from here on, the government of Egypt is going to take over. And you don't have any more worries. You just sign in as a bonded slave of the Pharaoh and Joseph. And the minute you do that, your problems are taken care of. Because from this time on, we'll let you go ahead back to your own places that used to be yours. They're now mine. And I'll lend you the tools. And I'll provide the seed, whatever you need. And you can produce for Egypt. And all we ask is that you turn over 20% of everything you make, and you can keep the rest." And they said, "No kidding. Would you be that generous, Joseph? That's great." And they said, "Let's hear it now for Joseph. Let's have a real cheer." So they cheered him, and they signed in, and they signed away their freedom. And freedom and private property ceased to exist at that time. Now, nothing seemed to happen to Joseph. The story goes on in the scriptures to tell us about how he brought his brothers in, and they too came in to get food and so on. But there's an interesting development that began to occur in another neighboring country, where there was another king that learned of what was going on in Egypt. And he sent spies in to find out about it. And the spies came back and reported, and they said to him, there is a man in Egypt whose name is Joseph, who is either the greatest genius who ever came down the cosmic pike, or he's psychoceramic. That's a crackpot. So the king said, how do you know which is which? And they said, we can't tell. But this fellow has become a Secretary of Agriculture, and he has established an ever-normal granary. And it's either going to mean plenty and prosperity for Egypt from here on, or they're going to go broke. And the king said, let's wait and see. And so with the passing of time, Joseph lived out his life, and the Pharaoh that he served lived out his. And then a new Pharaoh came to the throne. But as the new Pharaoh came to the throne, the economy of Egypt collapsed permanently. And when the neighboring country made this discovery, then a great army was raised, and it came across the Egyptian border, sweeping all before it. And at this time, men ran into the Pharaoh, crying, O great Pharaoh, come and save thy people. And the Pharaoh hitched up his chariots, and he went out, calling on the people to rise to be his army, to defend their land. And the people looked up from the places where they were laboring as serfs in the field, and they had the expression of dumb, driven cattle on their faces, and they said, who, me? I should volunteer for a war like this? It is a matter of supreme indifference to us who is Pharaoh. We don't own anything. We don't own our own lives. We don't own the land that we till. We don't own anything. Ownership has ceased to exist, and with it our freedom. So go ahead and have your war, but I will not help you. And so the invading army swept over Egypt like a scourge of locusts, and that particular kingdom was overthrown. Now, as you realize, I've taken a few liberties with the script, but I haven't taken any liberties with the story, because that's the story that you'll find if you take a good look at Genesis and read the story of Joseph. And some of what I've told you, where it touches on historic events, is factual. The invasion of the Hittites and the drying up of the Nile, those are true. And for all I know, the whole thing may be true. What is important to realize is this, that when people become dependent on the government, and they ask the government to solve their problems in any area, government doesn't solve problems. And the conditions that may have been bad become worse. And in the end, freedom is lost, and people revert to slavery and oppression. Thank you.